Welcome to the Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston. I'm very pleased that you chose us for this incredibly important part of your education and your career, and I look forward to hopefully meeting you in person at some point over the next year. One of my favorite things to do every year is select the book for our social justice summer reading program that we invite all of our GCSW community to read, including our faculty, staff, and alumni. But for our incoming students, the social justice summer read becomes the first part of your educational experience with us, as you'll read this book over the summer and then discuss it throughout your foundation experience. The books that I choose for this series reflect our commitment to racial justice and our commitment to standing up and fighting against racism and white supremacy. Over the past several years, we've all become aware of the problem of police violence against Black men and women in America. We've seen that happen horribly and tragically again and again in the past several months. We also know that police violence is just one of the problems associated with the so-called criminal justice system and the prison industrial complex. Mass incarceration and over-surveillance that disproportionately and intentionally targets Black and brown people, destroys families, separates parents from children. It ruins people's abilities to earn income upon release and often leads to further crime. We also know that it does nothing to deter crime. Incarceration is also inhumane. The inhumane treatment of prisoners is something we as a country have to begin to reckon with. This became very apparent to me this past spring during the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the beginning of the pandemic, public health experts across the country have warned us that jails and prisons are the perfect breeding ground for a widespread and life-threatening outbreak because of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and the inability to practice social distancing. In cities and jurisdictions across the country, efforts were being made to release nonviolent offenders and in some cases suspend arrests and nonviolent crimes to try to protect the inmate population from a mass outbreak. Here in Houston, I, along with many activists, pleaded for our elected officials to take similar actions. In Harris County, over 75% of the people who are incarcerated haven't even been convicted of a crime. They're only in jail because they can't afford bail. But despite knowing the risks the prison population were facing, nothing was done to protect them. Today, over 1,000 inmates in Harris County Jail have tested positive for COVID-19, and several have died. And at some point, I started to ask myself, at what point do we as a society decide that someone's life no longer has value? At what point do we decide that it's acceptable for people to die unnecessarily? We should never get to that point, but that's how we as a society have treated those in prison. So this summer, I selected Felon, a book of poems by Reginald Dwayne that through the author's own lived experiences tells of the harmful effects of incarceration. But as we've watched the last several weeks unfold, as we've seen the pandemic continue to disproportionately impact Black Americans, and as we've all watched in horror at the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Sean Reed, and Tony McDade, each at the hands of law enforcement, as well as the murder of Ahmaud Arbery at the hands of white vigilantes, I began to think that we needed to be reading more. The problem of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex is just one of the problems facing Black people in America. And at the root of each of these problems is racism. Racism in its very overt forms and racism in the more subtle forms that people of color have to deal with day in and day out, that is often not talked about, but needs to be talked about. So this year I selected a companion book, Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine. These two books in tandem provide a way to look at and talk about racism and the harm it causes through our systems and our institutions, but also in the day-to-day interactions we experience. Because regardless of whether it's overt harm, such as the harm caused by mass incarceration, or the direct harm inflicted on Black Americans by law enforcement, or it's the more subtle acts of racism that manifest through microaggressions, or as Dr. Ibram Kendi calls them, the racist abuse that people of color face in our society every day. The harm and the destruction that racism causes is the biggest challenge we face in our society. So I invite you to read along with us this summer and to critically think about what you read, and then to engage in conversation with us throughout the academic year as we explore these issues further. Once again, welcome to the Graduate College of Social Work. I couldn't be more thrilled that you chose to earn your master's degree from our program, and I look forward to seeing more of you this fall.